Okay, welcome everybody to our 1 hour webinar for the CGschool. Today we're going to be talking about architectural photography, and we're also going to talk a little bit about our class that's coming up on the subject of architectural photography, which will be held as a 2-day workshop down in Miami. We figured Miami would be a much better place to spend a wintry day outside shooting photographs as opposed to up here in Boston, where I'm currently at Neoscape Studios. The 2-day workshop, just to give you a brief overview, is a little different than some of our other classes in the sense that because it's such a hands-on workshop and we're going to be outside actually shooting and taking some photographs, we probably won't be able to do a simulcast webinar on it, but we are discussing the possibility of filming it and possibly making that available after the class. So as you can imagine, with any architectural class, any architectural photography class, you've got to start with some of the camera basics. And it doesn't matter if you've never picked up a camera before or if you're an avid photographer. Sometimes it's good just to get a different look at it or a refresher. And we go through all of the normal standard settings such as ISO and exposure and shutter speed, those types of things, white balance, depth of field, how to bracket photos, but then also some of the things that you might not think about if you don't shoot photographs on a regular basis, and that's how do you prepare for a shoot? What equipment do you need? What type of lenses are good? Tripod considerations, memory cards. And then other things that have less to do with equipment and more about securing permissions, actually approaching the institution or location that you want to shoot at and making sure that it's okay for you to shoot there. Being able to look up the weather conditions and sort of plan accordingly, since that is a huge factor in how your photographs are going to come out. And then we go over in the class as well how to predict sun angles. There's a couple of great online resources that allow you to type in any place on the map and get a sun chart for that day so that you know exactly where to be at any given time and what your window of opportunities like. We talk a bit about color management and calibration. That's a really important that's something very important for not only photography, but also those of you that are visualization artists as well, so that everything that you're looking at is calibrated and predictable. We go through a whole variety of different lenses, your standard lenses, really wide angle, telephoto, and then some of the more interesting ones, and I'll show you a couple images today from a perspective correcting lens, which is the lens that I use the most often, and a fisheye lens, which is happens to be really great for working on QTVRs and capturing panoramic shots. Then, of course, there's the special considerations, the different types of photography that you might have to run into, such as how do you shoot at night? What happens if you're asked to shoot aerial photography? If somebody puts you up in a helicopter, what are some considerations to do there? And then some more interesting types of photography, such as time-lapse or QTVR, and then something that's very popular with the visualization world, HDR photography. What we're going to talk about today in the next hour, just for the sake of being able to share my screen with everyone and give you something that you can take away from this, is we're going to talk a little bit about the post-processing of images. So imagine that we've gone and we've done our shoot and we come back with our images and we want to take them and improve them in our digital darkroom. And so for the next hour, what I'm going to be showing you guys is some photographs, good and bad, that I've taken, and what you can do in Lightroom and also in Photoshop. They happen to be very similar in terms of what Lightroom can do and what Camera Raw and Photoshop can do, and I realize not everyone has Lightroom, but it's a great solution for those of us that go out and shoot hundreds of photographs every week. So let me jump into Lightroom really quick. And I've taken a sampling of some photographs I shot over the past couple of years, and one of the things that I advise to all of my students is get out there and shoot any kind of photograph that you can, whether it's, even if it's just a simple point and shoot camera. It will make you a better visualization artist, and it's just something that will improve your artistic abilities like no other thing. One of the great ideas behind going out and shooting a bunch of photos is that you're actually taking hundreds of compositions a day as opposed to just a few, let's say if you're working on the computer inside a 3D Max or something. So this first image that I'm showing you is not something that's particularly awesome, but it was shot on the Architectural River Tour in Chicago. So it's on a moving boat, and of course you can't pull out a tripod and have the boat stop and shift your lens up and do all that kind of fun stuff. So this was actually a photograph that was shot just using a point and shoot camera. Now, there's a couple of nice pieces of software out there besides Lightroom that are helpful in situations like this. One of those pieces of software I'm going to open up is called Shift-N. Let me just go to my desktop and open up Shift-N. Shift-N happens to be a free piece of software that if you just do a Google search on it, you'll be able to find. And what's great about Shift-N is that if you open up an image inside of it, and it will open up JPEG files or TIFF files. You can see it gives us the EXIF data over here and tells us how this was shot. But it looks for lines that are vertical in your image. And if I click on automatic correction, it's going to compute the gradients, detect those lines, and it's actually done a pretty good job of taking all those vertical lines and straightening them out. So, you know, one of the standard conventions in architectural photography is to shoot with your vertical straight, or also, in those of you that are from an illustration background, it would be more like a 2-point perspective rather than a 3-point perspective. In Shift-N, you can see that it picked up these green lines, and the green lines are ones that it decided were vertical. In this image, it's done a really great job. If for any reason it was not giving you the results that you wanted, you can actually use your mouse button and drag over the lines that you wanted to ignore. In this case, we're all set. Under the options, and it's a pretty simple program, but it's great that it's free. If you go to type of output, we can choose whether or not we want to save a JPEG, a TIFF file. If we wanted to trim automatically, and if that's set, it will automatically crop the image out here. And we can also give it some bicubic resampling if we want, and a little bit of sharpening, a suffix to it. And if I go ahead and I save this out, I'm just going to save it out as a JPEG for right now. Helps if I remembered where it actually saved it. Oh, I have to hit Save Results. Got one step ahead of me there. So now that it's saving the results, we'll open this back up and take a quick look. So here's the image that it just corrected, and you can see that our verticals are now straight, and it's done a very good job of taking these edges and cropping them. What you'll notice, though, is that in this image, and it's very slight, but that particular point and shoot camera that I have, there's a slight bit of bowing in the lens. There's a bit of lens distortion. And another great piece of software that that's relatively inexpensive is something called PT Lens. And PT Lens is, I'm just going to open this up really quick. PT Lens is great for taking the barrel distortion out of your images. Now, you'll see in a minute when I get into Lightroom, Lightroom and Photoshop CS5 have added this type of lens correction to it. The only issue with that currently is that you either have to, you hope that your camera is input and that data is available, or you have to go out and create a distortion map and bring that in. For this particular camera that I was shooting with, my little point-and-shoot Canon, the SD1100 IS, I tried to bring that into Lightroom or CS5, and it didn't recognize my camera. But PT Lens has seen it, and what you do is you just put in your lens. It actually sees what the focal length is, and if I turn on and off preview, you can see that it's actually taken that geometric warp out of the image. So if we were really trying to get this to be as accurate an image as possible, we would run it through PT Lens first, and then we'd run it through our Shift-N procedure, and we would have an image at the end where the verticals would be straight and the distortion would be taken out of it. So those of you that just have a point and shoot, or maybe some of your lenses have a little bit of this barrel distortion, this is a really good way to process your images first and foremost, so that you remove that. It's essential in architectural photography where you want straight lines to be very straight. You can also batch those procedures as well. You can choose a whole directory of images and basically apply it. So those are just a couple of side points to get us started. Let me go back to Lightroom here. Now this is an image that I shot on vacation of Calatrava's Milwaukee Museum of Art. It didn't happen to be a very beautiful day when I was out there. As a matter of fact, I picked some of these images to show you for that explicit fact, because some days you're going to get out there, especially if it's something that's out of your control, where you're out on vacation and you sort of have one opportunity to do it. It's nice to be able to take a shot, shoot it in camera raw, and that's essential, and then be able to bring it into something like the Camera Raw importer or to Lightroom, which is very similar, and adjust it. So let's talk a little bit about how you can adjust it. First of all, let me go ahead and reset this image. This is what this photograph looked like when I shot it. Not my best work. Part of this was I was out trying to shoot very quickly because I was on my way into the museum, so I didn't want to hold things up. And the other thing was I decided to rent a lens that I hadn't used before, which happened to be a pretty cool lens, a perspective correcting lens that I had gotten from Lens Rentals. Let me just pull it up really quick. Lens Rentals is a great resource for going out and renting lens for, especially if you're going to go on vacation or something like that. It was part of this specialty lens, and it was this lens right here, the Schneider 2.8 Angulon, the Super Angulon for a Canon. The reason I rented it is because it's actually really high quality optics, and it was meant to be remarkably sharp. Well, that's great. The problem, though, with shift lenses, and we get into this during the class, is that the internal light meter of your camera doesn't respond the way it does to normal lenses. So it was a little tricky trying to shoot this on the fly, but that's okay because I knew that if I got it in the right ballpark, we would be able to, I'd be able to get what I wanted out of it. So one of the things I'm going to do quickly in Lightroom is I'm going to make what's called a virtual copy. And that virtual copy is nice for just letting me save my settings and then try to, maybe figure out a little bit of a different scenario. When I did that, you see here that it says 1 of 2. Well, it automatically stacks these images, which is a nice feature. Let's say that you go out and you shoot a whole series of photographs that are all from the same vantage point, and you want to be able to take individual pieces of each photograph and kind of put those together as a composite in Photoshop. Well, it's nice to have just a single stack without having, you know, hundreds of images, and I'll show you another nice thing you can do with a stack of images a little bit later. So let's open up this one. I'm going to go ahead and hit reset, and let's start talking about what you can do with a raw image and inside of Camera Raw. So the first thing that we notice is that my white balance is out of whack. This is way too cool. There's not very much warmth at all to it. And then we also realize that the exposure is, well, it's pretty much, it's overexposed. If you look over here at the histogram, you see this big blue spike. And if I go up to what's being clipped, well, that's bad news if we shot this in JPEG, because we would be stuck with that clipped image. The nice thing about shooting in RAW is that it gives us a stop up and down. So if you see that I actually start to drag my exposure down here, all of that information is still intact. And that's really, really key. That's super important. Had I done that with my point and shoot image that I showed you here, I would have that would have been game over. But because this I shot in RAW, I was willing to accept some a little bit of issue with it. So if I start to bring down my exposure, and these buttons up here actually check your clipping, both black and white, and you can see that I've got very little bit clipping here, and that's where you want your images to be mostly. So now that we've adjusted our exposure problem, one of the other things that we'll notice is that our color, our white balance is really off. Now there's a couple of things you can do in terms of white balancing your image. You could just go through one of the presets here. If I wanted to automatically let Lightroom determine what it thought the white balance should be, I could go ahead and choose auto. That's a little too red in my estimation. It's not quite what I want. You could quickly kind of walk through, okay, daylight at 5500 Kelvin here, that's looking a little better. Cloudy day, shade. Tungsten is going to be super blue because it's combating a really warm light. Obviously, fluorescent's not going to work, and it wasn't shot with a flash. So let's go ahead and leave it as shot, and then now let's start to actually just experiment with what our settings ought to be. So if we look at maybe bringing this temperature up to normal, that's getting us really close to that 5500 range that it was looking good at. And then we've also got way too much purple in there, so we want to back off the purple. So if I slide my slider to the right, it's going to add magenta. If I slide it to the left, it's going to add green. And let's say this is about what we want. Well, if I just hit the slash key, it's going to show me where we were before. Actually, let me just reset this really quickly. Well, what Lightroom's doing is actually remembering our fully corrected image, which you could see that we're starting to get to where our fully corrected image is, but not quite there yet. But that's okay. So we've adjusted some color balance. You can also take your white balance and actually put your cursor over the thing that you think should be white in your scene, or neutral gray. And if you look at the thumbnail up here on the left-hand side, you can actually look at what that white balance change would be interactively. So if I just chose something that I thought should be white, that's what Lightroom would correct it to. If I chose something that was really blue, it would combat that with an additional set of warmth. Now if we look at what we can do in our tonal adjustments, we have the ability to just choose auto, which will automatically correct our exposure and run through contrast and brightness and fill light. And that's actually done a pretty good job considering where we started. For the purposes of what we want to look at, let's go ahead and do it manually. So one thing about Lightroom is that when you want to reset, if you just hold down the Alt key, you can click on Reset for any one of the pieces. So that's reset our tone. And let's go ahead and drop that exposure. Now the recovery tool works on this area up in the histogram, and the recovery is a way to bring back your blown out brights. So if I just bring my exposure back up to where this starts to clip our brights, if I turn on the recovery tool, you'll start to see it push back those bright levels. And if I go all the way up to 100, it takes all of those bright values and pushes it back so that it is at 100%. In this image, that actually helps out quite a bit. Now, what we want to do is we want to keep our exposure down just a little bit. We can use our recovery tool to bring back some of those clip highlights. And let's say this image was too dark in this area down here. Well, if it was too dark in the shadows, we could actually bring up some fill light. So if you look in just this area here where my cursor is, and I bring up the fill light, you'll see that it starts to add more detail into those shadows. We're losing a bit of contrast that way, but and of course all of this is very subjective, but in this case I don't think we need a whole lot of fill light, but it's there for the times when you need it. And then our black point of the image is this point right here on the histogram, so the very far left. And you could see that there's actually a distance between the black in my scene and what should be 0. So if I start to bring this black point up, you see the histogram creep over to the left. And what you can do is you can also turn on this clip notification so that if I start to put too much black in there, you see where it turns blue. That's where it's clipped those channels. So we want to leave as much unclipped as we can in this scene. So let's go ahead and make it something like 6 or 7. Now we've got brightness to contend with, and brightness is a little different than exposure. And you could see if you just watch the histogram up here, and you can watch what brightness does. It slides the middle of the histogram sort of left and right. And in this case, the default setting for brightness is 50, but maybe that's just a little too much. And if we back it down some, that starts to look better. And then contrast as well. If I drag my contrast all the way down, look what happens to the histogram. The histogram starts to compress. And so that takes all of this data and it pushes it together in the middle, and that removes the contrast out of it. If I go the opposite way, it's going to do the opposite effect, and it's going to spread out the colors of my histogram. So you start to see this widen out and cover a wider part of the histogram. Now in this particular image, the contrast wasn't so bad for us before. That was okay. So let's go ahead and leave it there. Now we're in better shape than we were when we originally started, and just to remind you, I'm going to click over to my virtual copy, and that might just take a second. And I'm going to hit reset, and that's where we were, and that's where we are. So we're starting to get a little bit better, but our whites are slightly clipped. Let me just undo that and bring it back. So that might mean that let's try to bring it down some. Our recovery can come up, our exposure can cut down. Okay, we've got a couple other issues to contend with here. We've got, looks like I had some dust and scratches on my lens, which is something that you want to avoid whenever possible, but in this case, like I said, it was quickly kind of a run and shoot. So another tool that we can use is the spot removal tool, in Lightroom, and it works. I'm just scrolling my mouse wheel up and down to make that brush smaller or lighter. And if I actually put it over one of these spots and I drag my cursor over to where I want it to sample from, it will heal that area. So let me just zoom in here for a second. So you can see that there's where it's healed it. Let me do another dust and scratch here. Click, drag to where I want it to sample from, and now it's cleaned that up. It's a great little feature to be able to kind of salvage some of these pieces, and you can see that it does a really nice job. It's seamless. This works very similarly to the heal brush in Photoshop, and so if you don't have Lightroom and you just have Photoshop, then the heal brush will be probably your tool of choice. So let me just click a couple more of these spots. Looks like I have one in the cloud over here. Okay. One of the hotkeys that you can use in Lightroom is H, and H is going to hide those tools because we don't want to actually look at our image with all these bubbles on it. We just want to hit H and then let those disappear. Okay, so if I had planned accordingly and I had a tripod out here and some time to shoot, I might consider, because the sky is going to be so much lighter than my environment, I might consider putting some type of graduated filter on it. And so the next tool over here is a graduated filter. So if I pull down this graduated filter, you can see that it's overlaying a gradient on my scene. And if I want to give that a color, let's say I want to make it a darker blue, I can adjust the color by one of the presets, or I can start to slide down in here and choose a color that I want. I can also adjust the saturation. Okay, so we had a little bit of sound trouble there. Can everybody hear me again? Okay, great. Not sure what happened there, but I apologize that we lost it. But we'll pick up where we left off. It sounded like when I hit H on the keyboard to hide our spot correction tool, that's when we lost things. So let me just go back to where I was at that point. I was putting in a gradient, a graduated filter, and the graduated filter is the shortcut M, or it's this icon here to drag down a gradient. And this gradient is set by default to have no color and a +1 exposure, but what I really want is I want to drop the exposure down from that gradient so that it deepens the color of my sky. And I may even consider choosing a color to help improve those colors of the sky. So now what we've got is we've got a sky color that is a little nicer. It's not as muted as it was before. And if I click on my other image that we had started with, hopefully it'll. Maybe if I close a couple of these things in the background, I'm not sure why. Lightroom on a 64-bit machine is actually pretty snappy. There we go. It just looked like it was having a video refresh problem. So in the one that I had finally corrected, you see that I have a graduated filter that we just put on. I dropped the exposure, and I also reduced the saturation a little bit. At the same time, I'd taken another graduated filter from the bottom, and I'd given it a little bit of warmth. So I'd actually picked a little bit of a yellowy orange color. So let's go ahead and let's do that on the image we're working with. All right, so if I go to my graduated filter tool, I'll drag this up from the bottom. As I mentioned, it puts an automatic exposure on it. We don't want to do that. And let's put a slight bit of warmth to it. Yeah, that looks a lot better. So now we've got a little bit of warmth at the bottom of the image and combating the cool here at the top. Again, all of this is subjective, and because we're working in Lightroom, it's non-destructive. That's one of the great things about working this way. You can work in Camera Raw just like this as a non-destructive file, and that's important. If you were to try to do all of this in Photoshop, you could certainly do it, but you'd have a whole stack of layers and things that you'd be doing manually. And this is especially if you're going to try to go through a couple of hundred photographs quickly. This is a lot easier. So let's go down now and look at some of the other things that we can adjust. We've got a tone curve that's really just similar to what we were doing before with our exposure, recovery, the blacks, brightness, and contrast to adjust the histogram. This gives you an idea of what the histogram is, and this is really just like curves would be in Photoshop. You can lift up the highlights or bring the highlights down, the 3/4. You can boost the shadows or bring down the contrast of the shadows. You can also adjust the overall contrast of the image if you want to keep it sort of more of a linear fashion. If you want to introduce a slight S-curve, so you see this medium contrast gives it a slight S-curve. And then strong contrast actually gives it even more of an S-curve. Well, let's say strong contrast looks pretty good there. At least in this image, that's looking okay. So we'll go ahead and leave the strong contrast in. Now what we can do is we can get into our individual color sliders, and this is our hue, saturation, luminance. Each one of these you can actually adjust on a specific color range. So if we wanted to adjust the hue of our blues, we could either move them more towards the cyan and the green, or we can move them more towards the violet and purple if we wanted to. So this is a nice way to sort of adjust the overall color palette of your image, as well as you can adjust the saturation of each one of the colors. So if our blue was a bit too saturated, maybe we back off it. Our greens over there, or probably fall a little bit into the yellow as well. We can adjust how much saturation we want to have. For instance, in the red saturation, if I actually that'll be magenta. If I pull down the magenta saturation, the only thing that was really magenta in this scene was this woman's shirt. So if I wanted to back off of it a little bit, I could. I actually, in this photograph, I like the fact that they're sort of posing for a picture in front of us, and she's wearing the most colorful thing because it draws our eye right to the entrance. Okay, so the other thing that we can do in the HSL is we can look at the luminance of each one of these colors, and as you would imagine, you know, that's adjusting the sort of lightness and darkness, the values of those colors. And you can work on those individually. So if we wanted if our greens were a little too dark or our yellows were a bit dark, we could bring those up as individual color tones, and that's kind of a nice nice feature. If you wanted to look at all of these at once, you can click on all, and then you can have them list down. Anytime that you want to see what it looks like without those color adjustments that we just put on, we can click on this on-off switch, and there's an on-off switch for each one of these particular areas that we've been going over. If we don't like what we did, we can always hold down the Alt key, and we can reset the hue, reset the saturation, and reset the luminance, and then we're back to where we were. So that Alt key is a good shortcut to remember. All right, so next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what split toning does. And split toning is basically what it'll do is you can add a color, an overall color to your highlights and an overall color to your shadows. So let's say I wanted to sort of push this into a kind of a color process look. I could give it warm highlights, right, by adding a little bit of this orangey yellow and cooler shadows. And now what you see is that it almost looks like a bit of a cross process where all of the highlights and shadows have been tinted, and this balance then will determine whether it's weighted completely towards the shadows or completely towards the highlights. And you can get some interesting effects this way, and it's actually one of the things that I use on images, but very, 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 very subtly. And that is something you would do by just having just a little bit of saturation and highlights in that. So sharpening in Lightroom is really great, actually. It's the best place to do sharpening on your raw images as opposed to having it done in camera. What you want to do, though, is you want to zoom in to 1:1 and then look at your sharpening. So if you see here my image, it probably could use a little bit of sharpening in it. But if I put in too much, this is 150%, and that's too much. But let's just go ahead and turn it way up so that you can see what the other sliders do. If I make the radius larger, you can see that it's acting on a larger 3-pixel radius, and if I bring this down, it's working on more of a fine radius. And then the detail determines how much individual sort of pixel level detail it gets in. So if I turn that all the way up to 100, you can see what it would look like if it tried to increase the detail everywhere. So I like to leave the detail relatively small, and then we can look at our sharpening here at maybe 50%, and if I just turn this off and back on, you can see that we've gained a little bit of contrast at our edges. So again, that's a really nice nice feature of this. There's also, let's say you've got a little bit of grain in your image, and I'm actually a fan of a little bit of camera grain, but if you want to smooth that out, you can see up here in the clouds, if I turn my luminance noise reduction all the way from 0, you can see that there's some speckly noise. If I turn that all the way up to 100, it smooths out all of that noise and blends it together. The problem with that is you lose, some of your sharpness around your edges and so on. So you want to be cautious with how much of that you use. And then you can also reduce the color noise as well in a similar fashion. So if you shot something that had a little bit of color noise. As we mentioned earlier when we started with the look at Shift-N and with PT Lens, I mentioned that there's lens corrections that you can use inside of Lightroom or inside of Photoshop CS5 in the lens correction. Well, in this particular case, because I shot with that Schneider lens, I shot with a Schneider lens that doesn't show up on their list. So until I make a lens profile that works for it, or until someone makes a Schneider 28mm tilt shift lens available, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at maybe adjusting the distortion manually. One of the key things that you want to do about distortion, first and foremost, is you want to make sure that your horizon is level. So if I shot the photograph and it was a little bit tilted on axis or something like this, one of the first corrections that I'll do on all of my shots is just to make sure that that rotation that makes the horizon level. So in this case, it's almost dead on, but it needed to be rotated a tiny little bit. There's also not very much in this scene that's completely vertical. All of these straight lines are bent in. These posts are vertical here, but they're so close to the center of the frame that we're not really seeing much barrel distortion. But if there was barrel distortion on this image, you could either reduce the number to combat it, or lessen it, and that's something that that you can do pretty easily by eye, especially once the grid is on. The constrain crop tool, in this case, because I rotated it slightly, it's going to crop my image then to the edge, and that's just the same way that Shift-N worked, where wherever there was a gap between it and the frame, it crops off that excess. If we wanted to put a little vignetting around the side, we could reduce this to help darken the edges. Vignetting is something that can make an improvement. It's something that you actually try to avoid when you're shooting in some cases, but it can enhance the effect. I know some people use this for their renderings to give it a little bit of a more of a photographic look, as well as they'll use chromatic aberration. If I turn my chromatic aberration way up on both sides and I zoom in, you can see what it's doing is it's actually put in this offset of chromatic aberration of the magenta and the green. And if I just turn this back off, you can see that it took that away. So in this case, I'm not trying to introduce any chromatic aberration. It's actually something that's an artifact from your lens that you try to avoid. But in certain circumstances, if you were to bring in a rendering into Lightroom and you wanted to give it a tiny bit more of a photographic look, you might be very, very subtle with the amount of aberration that you add to it. One of the new things that's been added to Lightroom 3 is the ability to put in photographic grain. And this actually does a really nice job of grain. again, you want to be pretty subtle with it, but let me just turn it all the way up so you can see. So this is at 100%, and this adjusts the size of the grain. And you can see it actually kind of blurs out the detail too, which is nice. Instead of just overlaying a grain that's a noise on top of a sharp image, it actually begins to affect what's behind it and gives you this sort of pixelated look. And that's really important because now it actually begins to act more like grain. And obviously that's too much, but let's go back to the default values here of maybe we can put in a slight bit. In this case, I don't necessarily want it in my photograph, but if I were to try to, again, if I was trying to take in a rendering and make it look a little bit more photographic, I might apply the slightest bit of grain to it. And then, of course, you can calibrate your camera. So if you shoot with the same setup all the time, you can actually shoot with a series of measurable targets and bring in that data and set up your own calibration that you can basically bring in as a default, so that that it will automatically kind of color correct the images to that particular camera. So I'm going to switch over to the image that we had corrected at first, and just kind of quickly look through some of the things that that we had done. Okay, I'm going to zoom back out. And you can see when I reset this image here, that's where we started, and that's where it ended up. And it's a much nicer image. It's got some warmth in the lower portions of it. It's got some nicer saturation. One thing that we didn't really address was the presence tool. So let's talk quickly about what you can do with clarity, vibrance, and saturation. Clarity tries to do a bit of a sort of pseudo unsharp mask. If I turn clarity all the way down, we get sort of a dreamy, bloomy look that that blurs things out. If I turn it all the way up, it goes in and it works to try to bring out some of the details, but you get artifacting around the edges if you do it too much. So you want to be subtle again with your clarity. I get a lot of questions about what the difference between vibrance and saturation is, and vibrance was a feature that they added into Lightroom originally, and now it's made its way into Photoshop CS3 and 4 and 5 now. And really what vibrance is meant to do is vibrance is meant to take colors that are skin tones and colors that are already saturated and sort of protect them without clipping them, but bring up colors that need more saturation and sort of scale those saturation values up. So it's a bit of a smart saturation. If I bring up my vibrance, you can see that the colors that are already really saturated, like these greens and so on, aren't really getting a whole lot of change, but you can see that my sky is getting quite a bit of saturation, and it's leaving these colors that are sort of warm and even the colors that are more like skin tones. It's not really editing those that much. Whereas if I were to just put a saturation on, well, the saturation is we'll put equal saturation on any color, so it's not protecting our skin tones and those warm tones. It's really just getting in there and putting a linear saturation on all parts. So in most cases, photographs like this that have people in it, it's nicer to use vibrance. Let's take a look at a couple of other images that that were processed in Lightroom. This image is from the inside of that Calatrava Museum, and if I hit reset on it, you could see where that was shot. And so one of the first things you'll notice is that our white balance was off, as well as our histogram is way over to the right. Now, it was a white space, so it doesn't have a whole lot of data in there, and that was okay. I wanted these images to look a bit bright like that. And look at a couple of other ones. There we go. And so we brought back some of the warmth, a bit of the focus back out there, and a lot of these images, you go through the same process. Each one is slightly different in terms of how it was captured and what you get out of it. And what I was mentioning at the very beginning is that some days you're not out there on the optimal setting. So I was actually in Chicago, Millennium Park, shooting on a day that that was really cloudy, was really overcast, and I wanted to do something with these images of this Frank Gehry pavilion that would help bring them out. And so what I had done is I'd actually, similar to what we had just looked at, I'd done a few things with the graduated filter. You can see that there's a graduated filter that's blue, that's bringing in some saturation and bringing down the contrast, as well as some temperature adjustments to the color where I cooled it off a little bit. And you can also notice that there's a slight rotation that fixes the horizon. And overall, this image, because of the vibrance commands and bringing in some of the saturation to these areas, it looks a bit more like it was a sunnier day, and not, totally not overcast, but at least there's a bit more interest, visual interest in the scene than there was when I shot it. And here's a couple of other ones that went through a similar process. This one in particular was pretty gross looking in terms of trying to shoot it quickly and what it looked like in camera. But to be able to shoot in camera raw and then resuscitate it and do some things artistically to make it look better. So let's look at a couple of other quick things before our time is up. One of those things is let's take a look at what happens with this is a fisheye lens, and as I mentioned, there is the ability to change your distortion. And if I go into the profile, lens distortion here, and I turn on enable profile corrections, this fisheye lens happens to be a lens that was that's seen by our lens profile. So the 15mm fisheye lens is in there, and that does a pretty good job. I mean, you'll notice that there's some artifacting on the sides where it's had to stretch the image a lot more, but it's a good way to, if you needed to get out and shoot something that was reference and then bring it back into perspective. This profile correction is really great. And again, we probably want to rotate our horizon up so that it's back to straight. So I shot a similar series of photographs with a perspective correcting lens, and this is the main shot here. This is the center shot. You can see that this says a number 16 right here, and that means that there's 16 images as part of this stack. If I open up that stack by clicking on it and I walk through what these images are, this is my center image. This is the image with the camera lens shifted up. This is shifted up to the right, more to the right, and sideways and to the right. So what you can do with a perspective correcting lens is you can actually use it to shift and capture much more of a scene than you might normally be able to do. So if I shift left, and you see that I've captured all of these other images, this is shifted down. And what I end up with is a whole series of images that I can use to add on to this original image. So if I just right-click on this and I do Edit, Merge to Panorama in Photoshop, what it's going to do is it's going to open up all of those images in Photoshop, and it's going to work on aligning them for me and stitching them together. And it's going to do that automatically, which is a nice thing about Photo Merge. Let me make sure I grab the right file there. And these are pretty high resolution images. They're about 5K wide, and they were taken with a 17 millimeter Canon shift lens. And so what we're actually going to get is we're going to get a really huge, almost a full 10K wide image that's incredibly high resolution that you could use as a backplate for something. Take a minute and let that open. Okay, these are all DNG files, which stands for digital negatives, and we talk a little bit about what digital negatives mean in class. But let me go ahead and hit OK and let that work in the background. So that's going to take a couple of minutes for it to work. In the meantime, let me do something where we open up a rendering. In this case, this is a rendering that I'd worked on, and one of the nice things about Lightroom or Camera Raw is the ability to non-destructively color correct an image. In this case, this is the final PSD file, and I'm opening it up directly in Lightroom, and that's a new feature of Lightroom 3.3 or Lightroom 3, is that you can bring in these Photoshop files as PSD files and work on your color correction. And so it's a nice place to be able to experiment. Let's say if I wanted to play with what my white balance of this should be. Should it stay cool or should it become warmer? You can quickly start to run through iterations. Maybe my exposure's a little too high. Maybe I want to recover. It seems like Photoshop, while it's cooking in the background there, hopefully our audio doesn't give out again. If our shadows were a little too dark, we could bring in the fill light. This image, I believe, started, if I hit reset, it started somewhere like that. So you might say, okay, well, what happens if I put a little contrast in there? Well, that looks pretty nice. You can also get in and zoom in areas and take a look at how that might look. Maybe a bit of recovery. So that's just a nice thing. In our studio, we've done a lot of work now with bringing images into Camera Raw or into Lightroom and experimenting with them, overlaying gradients like we showed with the graduated filters. You can do certain nice color adjustments and exposures in particular areas that you can get nice quality blooms and so on. You can also blur images in this, and let me just zoom into an area, and so if I turn on my sharpness all the way down to a -100, you can start to see that this blurs those areas and removes some of the sharpness. But it does it in a really nice and photographic way. So if you were trying to work on some selective depth of field or just some selective blurring rather than kind of a Gaussian blur on the image, you can use this negative sharpness, and it's kind of a nice trick. So I switch back to Photoshop here. It's still aligning our images, but hopefully that'll be done in a couple of seconds. And the only thing I want to do after this brings in that image is I'm just going to open up a file in Camera Raw quickly and show you that it's very much similar to what we just showed in Lightroom. And for those of you that have Photoshop, you know, whether it be CS3, CS4, CS5, you'll have access to Camera Raw. The newest Camera Raw settings I don't believe are available for CS3, but I do believe they're available for CS4 and 5. And there's some the new features of the latest Camera Raw give you access to things like the graduated filter and some of those things that that we touched on today, as well as the grain, and I think it allows you to do some of the grain and some of the individual adjustments. I'm going to go ahead and close Lightroom to maybe give Photoshop a little bit more horsepower. You can see down here in the working size of that file, it actually is it's a pretty big file. It looks like it's almost 2 gigs putting that together. So could take a couple more minutes. While that's cooking, if anybody has any quick questions, I'll try to maybe answer a few questions. Some people have asked online here if there's, you know, what kind of camera should you use in architectural practices, or if there's any recommendation. For the class that that will be teaching down in Miami, I'll be working with a Canon 5D Mark II and a 17 millimeter shift lens. I happen to love that lens because it's able to shoot ungodly wide shots. It's really fantastic to be able to shoot that wide. Also, a 24 millimeter shift lens is in the arsenal, and I suggest shooting with a full frame camera, especially for architectural shots, so that you get as much, so that you don't get any sensor crop. But certainly there's a whole host of options out there in terms of cameras and DSLRs that you can use. I personally shoot most of the time with a 5D Mark II and that 17. It's also I advise you to shoot, you know, get a nice weighted tripod or something that's a pretty heavy duty tripod, so that it's not bouncing around. And that's really, you know, there's all kinds of other considerations that we get into from equipment in the class, but those are things that I would suggest off the bat. Couple of quick questions. Can you open up an EXR file in Lightroom? Unfortunately, you cannot open up an EXR file in Lightroom. Part of that is an issue with being able to adjust a 32-bit float file. There's very limited things that you can do with it, even in Photoshop. That's actually something that we talk about in tomorrow's webinar for Advanced Photoshop. And maybe one day it would be nice to be able to do some of these color adjustments on that, but for now, no, you can't. One of the questions was how did I enable the panorama? I enabled the panorama just by right-clicked on that series of images, and I said Edit in Photoshop. That are merged to Panorama in Photoshop, and that automatically does it automatically puts Photoshop into a photo merge. So right now our images are blending based on what it sees from image to image. So hopefully that'll cook its way through. Another question about Lightroom: does it give you the option to work with HDRI images? No, it really doesn't. It runs into the same problem that an EXR file has. You really can't work in 32-bit float mode inside a Lightroom. As they develop, I think as cameras are developed to sort of capture single-shot HDR images and some of those things, we might be able to see that as an advancement in the future, but currently it doesn't. There's a question in here about what makes a good size photo, and I assume that means resolution. It really depends on what the output of your image is going to be. If it's something that you're going to print as an 8x10 or an 11x17, you could probably get away with 10 or 12 megapixel image just fine. If you were going to something that was really, really high end, maybe you get into the 22 megapixel and beyond. The shots that we're blending together right now are about 22 megapixels each, and that's a pretty big size. It also becomes sort of cumbersome, as you guys are witnessing it right now. When you open up a bunch of these images together, it can take a while to put them to work on them. So that's a consideration as well. But I would say, things that are in the minimum right now is probably in the 10 to 12 megapixel range will give you the most options that you need. Good question here about what kind of image would you bring into Lightroom from a V-Ray rendering, similar to raw images. And the best type of image probably to bring in from V-Ray, first of all, I would save my file as an EXR, and I would maybe adjust it in Photoshop if I wanted to do a couple of adjustments. I would save that out as a 16-bit TIFF file, and I would bring in the 16-bit TIFF file into Lightroom and work on it. You're not going to have the same kind of raw capacity that you have with the ability to go up a stop or down a stop, but because you have that capacity in the EXR file in Photoshop, you should be all set in those regards. One of the questions is about why not a ping from V-Ray. You can certainly use a ping file, but Camera Raw really only works with JPEGs and TIFF files. Camera Raw is not set up to read a ping file, so a ping file wouldn't actually work in that type of setting. There we go. So now it actually took all of these images, all 16 of those images, and it built us a hybrid. And you can see what piece each one of these files used. So you can see how Photoshop has gone in and activated that. So now if I take this file and I merge it down into a single piece, and I compare this, let me go ahead and compare this to maybe our original file. That would have been Terrace 01. And because I saved out Terrace 01 as a digital negative, it's always going to open up in Camera Raw. And you'll see that we've got a lot of the same tools that we had in the previous one, including the graduated filter, our temperature, exposure controls, vibrance, and clarity. It's set up a little bit different in that there are tabs in Camera Raw here, but we've got our levels, our sharpening, our HSL values, split toning, the profile corrections or the manual distortion corrections, and then the special effects like grain, and then different presets and things that you can save, as well as snapshots. So this image is the original one that we had put together, or that I had taken as the center shot. And if I bring it into whoops, I had a mismatched profile there. And I'm going to bring that in as a different profile just so that we can see it quickly. And so you can see this is the outline, that frame of that original shot that I had taken, but by using the perspective correcting lens, shifting up, left, and down, we get an enormous field of view, which is really great for especially when you're trying to shoot something with reference, or maybe we only want to use this portion of the image so that we've got the ability to sort of grab more from the side that we couldn't see. Anyway, that'll wrap up our 1 hour. I'm sorry about the sound difficulties, but I'm glad that got that worked out. And hopefully we'll see some of you down in Miami in early February to run out and shoot some photographs together. Thanks.